Well, good morning, everyone. If your Bibles, go and open them up to the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 4, and we will begin there momentarily. It is so good to be back with you all this morning. I trust that all is well with everyone, and I look forward to our time together this morning. Matthew chapter 4 is where we begin, as you can see from the screen, behind me, to my right and to my left, in front of you. We're going to discuss discipleship this morning and look at it from the aspect of a disciple's commitment in comparison to an athlete. So this will be an open forum. You're welcome to ask questions and make comments, and I encourage that this morning to kind of have a back and forth. So I encourage any comments or questions, and we'll seek volunteers to read as well. So what is discipleship? That's the question I want us to examine this morning. And I think in our busy lives, we can become so focused on so many different things. We can be pulled every which way that we have the tendency to forget who we are, that we have a tendency to forget what we are. And we are, and you are, and I am a child of God. We are disciples of Jesus Christ. I want you to notice in Matthew chapter 4, it's the first commandment that he gave to 4 individuals in this text. It says in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus in verse 18 is walking by the Sea of Galilee. He saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them in verse 19, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And they immediately left their nets and followed him. And he says the same thing to James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. In verse 22, they immediately left the boat and their father and followed him. What did Jesus offer these men? He says, "Follow me." What did he offer them? I will make you fishers of men. Jesus did not promise them a good, easy, simplistic life. Jesus didn't offer them comfort. Jesus didn't offer them wealth. He says, "I will make you fishers of men." And with that includes following Jesus and listening to his teachings and witnessing his miracles, and then eventually suffering persecution very similarly as Jesus did. But what did these men do? They immediately left everything and they followed Jesus. But did you notice the first 2 words that Jesus says to them? He says, "Follow me." Follow me. So I want you to consider this question. What is a disciple? How would you define a disciple? Those 4 men, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, were all in from the very beginning. They immediately left everything, their job, their family, to follow Jesus. How would you define a disciple? They were disciples from the very beginning. How would you define disciple? What does it mean to be a disciple? A follower of Jesus Christ. Okay, it's a good start. How else can we describe what a disciple is? Follower of Jesus Christ. Service. Okay, Jesus set the ultimate example of what it looks like to be a servant. John chapter 13. What else? What other images or phrases come to mind? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Very good. Very good. And we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9 in a moment, where Paul speaks of having that discipline. That's a good tie-in to the word disciple. Any other phrases or images come to mind? Student. Very good, Rick. Nathan? Knowing the scriptures. Okay. So I think we have a pretty good handle of what it means and what it looks like to be a disciple. The biblical concept of discipleship emphasizes the teacher-student relationship. A disciple is a devoted supporter and follower of his teacher. He accepts the views of his teacher and adopts his teacher's way of life. The Greek word for disciple is a learner or a pupil, one who follows another's teaching. And the word involves more than our modern idea of a pupil or student. We may, in our mind, imagine, the teacher standing at the front of the classroom and the students are sitting at their desk, 20, 25, 30 students. And there's that teacher-student relationship. But the biblical concept of discipleship goes much further than that. It goes much deeper than that, where the student is doing everything he or she can to imitate and emulate the life of the teacher. You may remember, jogging your memory, however many years ago it was, in high school or college, where you had a teacher, you had a professor who you admired. And you went to for help. You went to for advice. How to write a paper, how to solve a problem, how to solve this equation. Just whatever the case may be, you had that go-to person, that go-to teacher or go-to professor. I had one at Wittenberg. His nickname was Mac. And I'd go to his office and we talked journalism and writing and creative writing. But I would never want to imitate or emulate his life outside of the classroom or outside of the hallway. I would not want to imitate or duplicate his life decisions. I went to him for a specific purpose. So in our relationship with Jesus, as a disciple of Jesus, it goes much further than this classroom setting that may come to mind. That we're doing everything we can to imitate our master. A disciple is a devoted supporter and follower where he accepts the views of his teacher and adopts his teacher's way of life. Luke chapter 6 and verse 40. Jesus says that's the goal in being a disciple. He says a disciple, this is Luke 6 and verse 40. A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. That's Luke chapter 6 and verse 40. To be Christ's disciple is to strive to be like him. Remember what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 37? What does Jesus say there? Matthew chapter 22 and verse 37. You shall love the Lord your God, right, with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. What's the key word in that verse? Well, there's love. There's a lot, trick question. There's a lot of key words in that verse. There's a 3-letter word that just really, all. What do we know about the word all? Complete. It's everything. So what does it take for you and me to be disciples of Jesus Christ? To give Jesus our all and everything. So I think what I want us to take away as we introduce this idea of discipleship, that there is no such thing as a sort of follower of Jesus. That disciples are all in, heart, soul, mind, all in. Disciples take what we do and who we are very seriously. And we're going to look at it from the angle of an athlete this morning. Go ahead and turn your Bibles over to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. There's a number of different ways that you can take the discussion of discipleship. You could take it from the perspective of what is our relationship with each other from a horizontal standpoint. What is our relationship with God from a vertical standpoint? What is our relationship to the lost? But this morning, I want us to look at our relationship in terms of our commitment. We know in today's day and time that sports is very important. It's very important to me, and perhaps it's very important to you. It's very important to our culture. It's very important to society and what makes a lot of our society tick and go. And it was important back then as well, during Bible times, which is why you see a lot in Paul's writings using the illustration or using analogies of athletics. Just a quick recap of what it looked like back then. The ancient Greeks were noted for their devotion to the games and gymnastic sports. And they believed it was just as important to develop the mind as it was to develop the body as it was to educate the mind. And games consisted of a number of different events, very similar to what we witness and we watch today. Races, jumping, discus, javelin, wrestling, boxing, and even contests between heralds and trumpeters. And contestants were trained under very strict rules and supervision. And these games were very popular in the first century, and stadiums were built in various places across the Roman Empire as large crowds came to watch these events. You're probably familiar with the Roman Colosseum. It seated about 50,000, little more than 50,000 spectators, and legend goes as they packed them in as sardines. And they were separated by rank, by class, by society. And that was the hub of everything. Much like a stadium today or arena today. Ohio Stadium seats more than 100,000. Basketball arenas, football stadiums. People come together to watch an event, to watch athletes, superior athletes perform. It's no different than back then as it is today. And because of their popularity, this is what Paul did, because people knew as they would read his writings where Paul was going with it. They could relate to his illustrations. They could relate to his writings and his analogies. He made good use of the games throughout his epistles. And the athlete provides an excellent example of the kind of commitment that Jesus requires from his disciples. So let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. This goes back to the idea that was mentioned a few moments ago as far as discipline and how the word disciple and discipline relate to each other. If I can have a volunteer to read 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 24 through 27. Go ahead, Vivian. Or Jim.
Verse 24. Know ye not that they which run a race run all, but one receives the prize, so run that you may obtain. Every man that striveth for the master is tempered in all things. How they do it to obtain a corruptible crown of earth and incorruptible. I therefore so run, not as uncertain, so light am I, not as one that thinks he is the air. But I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, that the money means when I have preached to others, I myself am cast away.
All right, thank you for reading those passages. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 24 through 27 was just read for us. And we're gonna examine this verse as we go along. I've got till 10:15, correct? Okay. So think about it from this perspective in this verse, and let's hone in on verse 25 to begin with. So Paul says, the one who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. There's that word all again. What does it mean to be temperate? What does it mean to be temperate? Self-discipline. See, there it goes back to the idea that you mentioned. Self-discipline, self-restraint, self-control over what? Self-control, self-discipline over what? In all things. What could be a struggle for us to control? Our temper. Very good. Our temper could be one that's challenging us to control. What else can we think of? I'm sorry? Lust? Our thoughts, okay? Thoughts. Our tongue. I think we get the idea, right? And how vital this is. If I am striving for this crown, how crucial it is in this race to make sure that I am in self-control. I'm able to discipline myself, bring my passions under subjection. And that idea is brought out to us in verse 27. And the idea that Paul tells us here is that he was willing to do anything and everything to bring those passions and those emotions and those feelings and those thoughts under control, because he recognized what's at stake. He recognized what's on the line. And Paul was willing to do anything that was necessary in order to render total obedience to God. We'll come back to this text. Any initial thoughts on the thought that Paul gives us in verse 25? There's training as well. That's right, Carl. And on that thought, let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 4. That's a good segue, Carl, into our next passage. 1 Timothy chapter 4, chapter 4, 7 through 8. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. And think of this thought as we read these two verses of training. Who's got that? 1 Timothy chapter 4, 7 and 8. Thank you, Rick.
Exercise yourself to godliness. Godly exercise profits a little. Godliness is profitable in all things, having promise of the life that now is and of that which is to come.
All right, thank you. Anybody reading from the ESV this morning? It says, train yourself for godliness. Train yourself for godliness. That's how the ESV translates it. Train yourself for godliness. And you notice in verse 8, bodily exercise profits a little. Godliness is profitable for all things. You train yourself for godliness. You train yourself for godliness. What does that mean? What does that look like? And we can compare it to physical training. I think we all have a good understanding of what it means to train physically. What about training spiritually? You think on these things. Yeah, your mind is thinking spiritual. Okay, we're going to talk more about that in our sermon this morning. That's a good thought, Sheila. Study, okay. Sue? Okay. An athlete is very calculated in his or her own personal training, right? Their schedule, their routine, their training or their lifting, watching film, doing all of those things. They're very calculated and scheduled to become the best athlete he or she can be. Conditioning, all of those things. For a spiritual athlete, let's use that term, just think of how much higher and greater we should amp that up. To be devoted in prayer, to be devoted in Bible study, to be devoted to be here whenever the doors are open, to think spiritual things in your day-to-day walk. You know, where does your mind gravitate toward? Does it gravitate toward more spiritual things or physical or temporal things? But it all comes back to the phrase, but godliness is profitable for all things. There is value of physical exercise, but that's short term compared to the value of spiritual exercise. I saw a couple other hands. Rick, did you have something?
Yeah, so I think one for me is just exercise, build and share the gospel. The story of Jesus is probably the greatest story. Sharing it with other people, understand how to present that, how to address questions they've got, how to help them understand why that's the right decision in their life. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, good answer. Good thoughts. Any other thoughts or questions or comments? Okay, let's quickly go to Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5, and one other verse that connects to what we're talking about for this point. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 14. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 14. Hebrews 5 and verse 14 says, but solid food belongs to those who are full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. I'm reading from the New King James Version, and it says, have your senses exercised. Some versions render that to have your senses trained. Now, if you dig a little deeper and look at the Greek word is where we get our English word gymnasium. So you see how beautiful of a connection that is? So I think the idea that the Hebrew writer is expressing to us is be a person who can't get enough time in the spiritual gym. You be a spiritual gym rat, if you're familiar with that term. You be that person who is always in the gym. Always in the gym. So then when the lights come on, as a spiritual athlete, you're ready. When Satan is attacking, you're ready for that response. When somebody asks you about Jesus, what can you tell me about the Jesus you serve? You're ready for that response. Because you've been in the gym and you've been working out and you've been training. Here's a second point to consider. An athlete, a committed spiritual athlete, must be committed to competing by the rules. Turn over to 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2. Let's look at verse 5. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5. Back in ancient Roman times, no competitor could be crowned unless they competed in accordance with the rules. In ancient Roman times, if an athlete broke the rules, he was not only denied the crown, but sometimes disgraced and even punished. Now, if you follow sports, you know that throughout recent history that there have been athletes and there have been teams and colleges and programs who have been busted because they violated the rules. And they had awards taken away. They had banners taken off the rafters, trophies stripped of them. So this is a real thing that if you do not compete by the rules, you will be punished. What does Paul tell Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5? Who has that? Who'd like to read that for us? 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5. Thank you, Jeff.
If a man also strive for mastery, that is, do not crown, but strive on.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. What is Paul saying here to Timothy? Okay. And we understand that from a secular standpoint. We understand that from an athletic standpoint. And the same holds true spiritually. That if we do not follow the rules, then we will not enjoy the ultimate prize that awaits us, that Paul speaks of in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. There are certain requirements that are set forth by God. 2 Timothy, I didn't have it up there. Oops. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 13 tells us this, just a chapter over. Hold fast the pattern of sound words, 2 Timothy 1 verse 13, which you have heard from me in faith and love which are in Christ Jesus. Hold fast the pattern of sound words. If we defect from those sound words, then we will lose our reward. What are the rules? We could spend the remainder of our time talking about that, but I want you to think. I want you to think about this question. Think about what Paul is saying here to Timothy. What are those sound words? What are those sound teachings? The sound doctrine? Because if we don't have that, we don't stand for it, stand for the truth and stand in the truth, Paul says we will lose our reward. Just a couple other thoughts that tie into that our lives must be conducted within the authority of the inspired word, 2 Timothy 3 and verse 16, that there's one faith, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 5. So is the Bible your go-to source, the source in how you live your life? Is the Bible your go-to source in how you live your life? Because if it is, and I hope and trust that it is, that's a game changer. That's a life changer. And if the Bible is my number one source, my go-to source, and I look at God's teachings, I look at those sound words, and it'll change my life if I apply those to my life. It'll change my marriage. It'll change the way that I look at my relationships. It'll change the way I manage my finances. It'll change my relationship with my parents or with my children. So the Bible must be our go-to source in how we live our lives. So a committed athlete is committed to competing by the rules. A committed athlete must also run to win. Let's turn our Bibles over to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. We'll look at verse 1. Victory, as we know, goes to those who run to win, who compete to win. It isn't just enough to enter the race or step onto the court or step onto the field. There's something else that's necessary in order to win. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. Who'd like to read that for us? Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1.
Let us lay aside every weight and stand with good so easily beset us.
All right, thank you, Vivian. The first phrase I want us to look at this morning is to lay aside every weight. Lay aside every weight. What do runners wear when they train? What are some things that they wear when they train? They wear weights. Yeah, they wear ankle weights or put some weights on their wrist or wear a weighted vest. Why do they do that? Why do they do that? Yeah, stronger, endurance. But would they ever wear one of those in the actual 26.2 mile marathon? They wouldn't wear a weighted vest. They wouldn't wear blue jeans. They wouldn't wear a parka. They're going to wear the lightest clothes possible, the lightest shoes possible. Why? So it's not a hindrance to them. So they could run to their full capability, their full potential. So we, again, using that athlete comparison, we understand that concept. We understand where the Hebrew writer is going with this. Because when the real race comes and begins, they shed everything that could hinder them. Nothing, they don't want anything to impede their progress moving forward. So what does that mean for us? He says, lay aside every weight. You're running this race, a race that is set before you. And he says, lay aside every weight. Lay aside every weight. Putting ourselves in a position where we could be tempted. Okay, good. Lay that aside. And I want to point out here that he's not yet talking about sin, because that's the next phrase we're going to look at. He says, lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. So a weight in our life may not necessarily be a sin. If those runners wanted to wear a weighted vest or blue jeans, they could if they wanted to, but it's not wise for them to do so because they would not compete at their full potential. What could be a weight in our life that isn't a sin, but that could hold us back, that could hinder us from running this race as well as we can? Family, right? People that we're around, very good. Friends. Our job could be a hindrance. What else? Friends, our schedule, money, and all of these things could be a hindrance. They're not sin in and of themselves, but those are things that are hard to put aside because we get attached to those things. We get attached to our job, we get attached to our friends, we get attached to our family. We get attached to those things, and it makes it difficult to lay those things aside. And many of those weights are proper, and they're needed, and they're necessary in our lives. But the Hebrew writer says, in order to get the reward, we must lay those things aside if they are hindering you and hindering me from running the race to my full potential. And he also says that could include sin. There could be sin in my life that I must get away from, that is just ensnaring me, and I've got to cast that aside because I'm not running to my full potential. Turn your Bibles over to Matthew chapter 5. Put a bookmark there in Hebrews 12. We'll come back to that here in a moment. But Matthew chapter 5, Jesus addresses this in Matthew 5, verses 29 and 30. Our sin can keep us from running with endurance. Jesus says you cannot hold on to those sins, whatever that sin may be. You can't hold on to that and expect to run this race and win this race. And he says in verse 29 of Matthew chapter 5, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Every sin is just another weight we are carrying as we try to run the race with endurance. Maybe it is some of those things that were mentioned earlier. Maybe it is temper or anger. Maybe it is just our thoughts are going in the wrong direction. Maybe it is selfishness. Maybe it's greed or just poor attitudes or even the sin of worry. Jesus says, you've got to do what you got to do to get that out of your life. You got to do what you got to do to cut it off because that's impeding your progress in running this race. Because we must run with endurance. That's the next phrase in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. Let's go ahead and revisit this text. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. It says, the very end, and let us run with endurance. To run with endurance. What does endurance mean? How would you define endurance? How would you define endurance? Withstanding whatever is in your way, you're going to overcome it. Okay? Withstanding is a good word. Patience. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Paul talks about that, 1 Corinthians 9. We'll revisit that here in a moment if we have some time. Endurance is defined as the characteristic of a man who is unswerved from his deliberate purpose and their loyalty to faith and piety by even the greatest trials and sufferings. We have purpose, right? As Christians, as disciples of Jesus, we have purpose. What we do, where we go, what we say, all of that is not by accident. We have a very specific and deliberate purpose. And endurance is being unswerved from that deliberate purpose. Why do we need endurance? Let's look at Hebrews 10, verse 36. Hebrews 10 and verse 36. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 36. For you have need of endurance, so that you have done the will of God, you may receive the reward, the promise, the great reward. Why do we need endurance? You talk to any elite, superior athlete, what are they all going to say to you? Have they been successful 100% of the time? Have they never failed? They failed over and over and over and over. But how did they get to where they are? With endurance. What's the thing? What do we have in common with those elite superior athletes? You can't quit. You got to keep striving, because what's going to happen in life? We're going to stumble. We're going to say some things that we ought not to say. We're going to do some things we shouldn't do. We're going to go some places where we shouldn't go. Paul says in Romans chapter 3 and verse 23 that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But what is necessary when we fall down? Do we stay down? We pick ourselves up and we keep going. We have endurance. That phrase, keep on keeping on. And we must remember that our race as a disciple is not a sprint. It's a marathon. And that we can't quit until that race is over. I think about what is said there in verse 36 of Hebrews 10. And then we get into chapter 11. What do we know about chapter 11? Hebrews chapter 11. It is the faith chapter. It's the Bible's Hall of Fame. What do we know about the individuals in that chapter? There's Abraham, and there's Rahab, and there's David, and we go on and on and on. They had strong faith. But was their life easy? They endured all things. Their life wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. It was challenging. We go all the way back to the Old Testament to understand how challenging their lives were, but the decisions that they made to please God that exemplified their faith. And we think about the person we follow today and all that Jesus endured for our sake. Jesus showed great endurance through rejection. He showed great endurance through suffering and even death. Any other thoughts or questions on endurance? Let me add a couple of these in here too, a couple of verses. We think about endurance and we fall down and we're going to fail. Why it's so crucial to have people in our lives, a church family in our lives, to be there when we need picked up. Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 27. The idea of iron sharpens iron. We need other people in our lives sharpening us and challenging us and picking us up when we're down. And then the imagery that we find in Titus chapter 2, that mentor, the older seasoned Christian mentoring the younger Christian. We need those types of people in our lives to help us get through those difficult times. We got a couple minutes left. Let's revisit 1 Corinthians chapter 9 one more time. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. There's the thing with athletes, they endure and they push and they strive. What's the end game, so to speak? What happens at the finish line? What happens when the buzzer sounds? How many winners are there? There's one. When there's the Boston Marathon, there's one winner. The one who completes the 26.2 miles the fastest. There's only going to be one Super Bowl champion in February. There's only one winner. And Paul uses that analogy to help us understand how crucial it is for us to strive in such a way, run in such a way that you may obtain it. But one receives the prize. But if there were only one prize given, one great reward or one great promise, will that change our approach at all? Will that change the way that we run? Will that change the way we respond to challenges? It's just something for us to chew on. That if there were only one prize to be given, would our approach change at all? But he says, run in such a way that there is just one, that everyone who competes for the prize is temperate, but they do it to obtain a perishable crown. Let's go ahead and stop there. What does the word perishable mean? What does the word perishable mean? Earthly, worldly. It's going to fade away. It's going to collect dust. Maybe you've got trophies or plaques up on your wall or from your kids, and they're hanging on they're on the shelves, and t-ball and little league and basketball and football. Just over time, those things fade away and they collect dust and they deteriorate. And we understand that principle. Those things are perishable, just like everything else in this earthly temporal world. But Paul says we're not striving for something that is perishable. What are we striving for? Something that is imperishable, something that won't fade away, something that won't deteriorate, something that won't collect dust. And you see how much more value that imperishable crown has versus the perishable, and the strive for the imperishable. You've been very kind with your time this morning. Went a little beyond 10:15. So thankful for your contributions. Thank you for your participation this morning.